Martin, thank you very much indeed. I realise that I'm probably look like something of a fraud because I should be in uniform. And the reason I'm not in uniform, I put a suit on because I thought I ought to show respect to the audience. But the reason I'm not in uniform is I have actually just handed over my job. And so I'm an army officer without portfolio. And I haven't cleared what I'm about to say with the MOD press office, which if you're above a certain rank in the army, you are obliged to do. So I thought I'd talk as a retired officer, and then when you lot all grass me up on what I've said, I'll still have to resign. So there will be an amusing outcome if I say anything untoward. But just to set the scene, I am in the army. That was the most proud moment of my army career. Standing between Sophie and Sean on the set, it was actually pissing with rain, and they were taking the mickey out of me. And I do look a bit of a prat, but I have watched Coronation Street since I was 17 for reasons I don't need to go into. And I had always been told that Weatherfield was Salford. I don't know if that's true, but I've always assumed that it was. So there are all sorts of reasons why my association with this university has that little extra poignance. Anyway, I missed it yesterday. Tina and Gary, it's not good. It's not good. Anyway. My agenda, what I'm going to do is talk briefly. I don't want to go on for too long about the army today by covering Afghanistan, because I'm very happy to answer any questions at the end, but there will be questions about Afghanistan, and so I'll just set the scene for that. And then I need to talk to you a little bit for my own conscience about how the army is changing. And then I'll go into the meat of what I was going to say, which is to tell you the story of last year's Olympics and the way that we reacted to a serious failure in venue security, last-minute failure in venue security, which is, I think, is quite a good case study of reaction to strategic level problems and challenges with decision-making. So, and that's the agenda for that, if I don't lose my way. Afghanistan, I suspect that almost everybody sitting here has been touched by Afghanistan in one way or another since 2001. And our intervention at a significant level has been going on since 2005. And while I'm not going to comment on whether it was right to go in, I think there is a huge debate to be had about whether it was right to go in, but I don't feel that I'm the right sort of person to comment on it. I have got a view that we have made a lot of mistakes along the way, but that's what happens when you're fighting an enemy who has a mind of their own. My sense is that we've reacted well, although sometimes rather slowly, to some of the challenges that we've faced. I think I have frustrations in certain times, certainly around 2009. I think there was a reluctance for us to concentrate our forces in that part of Central Helmand that was being really difficult. And you may remember we were spread in places like Sangin and taking a lot of casualties there, which in my view was all to do with poor troop density. And we did understand the problem a little slowly, and we concentrated our troop densities into Central Helmand by handing over some of our responsibilities to the Americans. We have learnt an enormous amount about operating in a very challenging cultural environment. I think we were quite cack-handed to start with in the way that we dealt with the local communities. I think we've learnt a huge amount. I think our equipment and our information management is 10 times better than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. I think we've learned a huge amount in that area. And critically, we've learned to let the Afghans get on with their job. A large Afghan security force has been trained. They're not perfect. I mean, you wouldn't expect them to be policing the streets here, but they are much more effective than they were, and they are very effective for policing the culture, certainly from a British perspective, in Central Helmand. And the intention is for them to take over fully by the end of 2014, and at the moment everything is on track. You'll have noticed over the winter there have been fewer casualties. The poppy harvest, and that's because of the weather and the conditions, things tend to calm down in the winter. The poppy harvest is going on at the moment. I've seen some very worrying statistics about the increase in opium production in Helmand, so I think there are still some real challenges in that sort of area. But while the poppy harvest is on, you tend to have a lower level of violence. And what we need to watch now is how high the levels of violence are through May, June, July and August, and how well the Afghan security forces can cope with them themselves, and the extent to which the ISAF forces, the NATO forces, have to come in to help. And my prediction is that they won't have to come in to help as much as they have in the past, and that the trajectory is right. But the issue is not in Helmand. The issue is in Kabul and Islamabad and Washington and London and Berlin and Paris. The effectiveness of the Afghan to run their country is not going to be decided by low-level tactical peace or instability in Helmand. It's going to be decided by an effective Afghan government in Kabul, supported as much as it needs to be by the international community. And the jury is, I would say, still out. There's a presidential election this time next year when President Karzai will be replaced. That needs to be monitored very carefully. It's important that there is a credible follow-on to him. And I have no hesitation in saying that part of the solution to this is some sort of strategic arrangement with people who call themselves the Taliban. Taliban is a really handy catch-all for a very wide range of different interests. But at the regionally strategic level, there has got to be a conversation with people in Pakistan and in other countries who have instincts and interests that align with what we call the Taliban, and they have to come to some sort of political accommodation. That will then create the stability necessary for a government to govern, and if there is a government governing, not like you would expect to see in Surrey, but a government that is governing reasonably well, then Helmand, which will continue to be quite a cheeky place to be, Helmand will be good enough and will continue to progress. And my goodness, it's a heck of a sight better than it was before. So when somebody asks me whether it's worth it, bearing in mind that I am not making any judgment about whether it was right to go in, as a soldier being told to go in, what I think we have done has been to make a real difference, and that is absolutely worth it. But my goodness, it's come at a price, and I absolutely recognise that. So I think there is a good story to be told about Afghanistan, but there's still a way to go, and there are defining moments over the course of the next 18 months. Fighting season over the summer, next year's presidential election, and watch talk of strategic arrangements between Kabul, Islamabad, and whoever the Taliban are. So that's a quick resume of Afghanistan. The greatest threat facing Britain at the moment is economic. That there is absolutely no question that our country's stability depends on a degree of economic stability. And I'm no economist, but I think we're in the shit. If we're in that, you can't afford to spend huge amounts of money on your armed forces. I mean, it goes without saying that you have to find a level that is reasonable without cutting into your forces to a level where they lose their ability to expand if the situation were to change. How I would have described it to my people, where you take the armed forces off the balls of their feet. We have to remain on the balls of their feet, but we don't need to have everything that some people have aspired to in the past. If that is going to damage the economy. I have to say I would be very concerned if it's just the armed forces who are taking the pain and that there are other parts of the economy that are not. So you end up having failed to solve the economic challenge, but having cut the bottom out of your armed force when there is going to be there will be some serious security challenges in the future. But certainly from the inside of the armed forces, it is entirely reasonable to change. We were told slightly, rather unexpectedly, on the 18th of July 2011, a date that's imprinted in my brain, that we were going to cut the army to 82,000 regulars and 30,000 reserves. And since that time, we've gone through a very detailed process of analysis to work out how the three broad activities, which I'll explain briefly, can be met by a force level of that nature. And there are three things that you would expect your armed forces to be able to do. You would expect them, whatever the size, to be able to deal with high-end violence. There's no point in having an army, navy and an air force unless they can deal with somebody who throws real violence at you. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need hundreds of thousands of troops who are all driving their tanks across the northwest German plain. But if you're a section of 10 men and somebody starts firing at you and throwing grenades at you, you need to be able to deal with that level of violence with very high-end capability. You need to have artillery, you need to have air support, you need to have very good information systems that can tell you what's going on. So the top left-hand ball, which we call contingency, is the capability to be able to deal with high-end violence. Where that comes from is not as important as understanding that even in a counterinsurgency like Afghanistan, you need contingent capability to deal with your enemy when he's really going at you with what we call, slightly bizarrely, kinetic weapons. But the big deal is the top right-hand ball, and we simply haven't got our minds around yet where the sources of instability are in the world that are going to undermine our national security in the future. But the prediction that we've come to is that you're going to need to get involved in multi-agencies, so not just the military, working with business, developers, non-government organisations and other governments and multinational partners. You're going to have to get involved in developing and helping countries to build so that the insecurity is stopped before it starts. Now that is naive up to a point, but it's a great principle. And if you concentrate on how you develop that capability in your armed force, you're then in a position where you can bring together, if you ever have to, your contingent capability with this ability to have been involved with people and to try to help them to build their capacity up in advance of a problem developing. So the conventional force is dealing with the top two balls, and we've got a long way to go continuing to define whether our ability to capacity build is refined enough. You have to work with a lot of other people, you have to change your techniques and tactics and techniques. There's a lot to be done. And I think in general terms, 82 regulars and 30 reserves is enough to deal with that. But it's how available they are, how integrated they are, how well trained they are, how capable you are of deploying them that is key. And we have to see how well the army can adapt in order to be able to judge whether they can deploy in an integrated way in the way that we would wish them to. The bottom ball is really important, and I'm going to come on to it in a minute. But my sense is that in this interconnected world, resilience at home is becoming more fragile. I am not suggesting that the armed forces are going to be stamping up and down the high street with their rifles. That is absolutely not what I'm suggesting. The police are in the lead. But I saw evidence twice last year where organised thinking and groups of disciplined people who can be deployed at short notice to assist were absolutely invaluable. I'm going to talk about the Olympics, but the picture there is a picture of tanker drivers who had a dispute which was challenging the government and challenging the government's ability to continue to do what they consider the critical threat to them is, which is run the economy. And we had at very short notice to train a capability to deliver fuel should industrial action occur. Now there are some huge constitutional issues, but underneath that, if the elected government decides that you are to provide that capability, Our job is to try to do it with what is generally a fairly generally trained workforce. I mean, I think we had something like 300 available tanker drivers who could do the sort of stuff that you would see on Morrison's forecourt. And we had to generate just under 2,000 in 6 weeks, which was a very big challenge. Now, you can do that if you've got an organisation with bossy people at the top, the capacity to bring lots of other capabilities together quickly, a very, very willing workforce who are prepared to put themselves out in order to be able to achieve what you want them to achieve. And my sense is that there are going to be more occasions where this sort of thing, not in industrial disputes, but more generally, this sort of thing is going to be required. And that goes a little bit against the culture of the United Kingdom, where the armed forces are to do stuff away, and we're very good at doing what we do at home. And the last thing you want is a size 12 military boot in the way. Well, our local authorities are less resilient than they used to be because their budgets have been tightened. I think the police are less resilient than they used to be because their budgets have been tightened. And it will be interesting to see how society reacts through this summer. And I am deliberately speculating, but last summer we were distracted by the Olympics. The summer before that, there was some very strange behaviour, which I don't think's ever been completely reconciled and isn't completely understood through the sort of summer unrest. Well, there's not going to be the same distraction this summer, so what's going to happen? How fragile is society going to be? And to what extent will organised groups of people, not in the front line, but just helping the machine of society operate, how important will they be? Let us see. Now, I'm now going to move on to the case study. Just slightly provocatively, I'm saying that my thesis is that the Olympics were saved by the armed forces. Of course they weren't. And what I think I need to do is just remind you of some of the statistics of that event, which at the time was quite a big deal. And on that list, I just want to highlight one particular thing, which is this bullet here about the workforce. I have an enormous respect for LOCOG. LOCOG was an organisation that was brought together very much as a just-in-time organisation. They were dealing with everything from the sporting event to catering to transport. They had a huge range of responsibilities, one of which was venue security. And I thought LOCOG was a remarkable organisation, and it was a huge operation. And then, of course, it built for the event and then disappeared I think by the end of September. It was quite difficult to find anybody from LOCOG to do our lessons learned process. So, big event. I'm just going to remind you of some of the scenes, if I can make the machine work. just two points that I'd like to make. The first is that the Olympics was about sport, and it was an extraordinarily successful sporting achievement. And I need to caveat everything that I say. If I use code, the Army, I'm wrong. It was an armed force response, Navy, Army and Air Force. And that just to sort of set the context. One other thing which I think is worth reflecting on as we sit in Salford, there was a very effective plan to try and bring in the rest of the country to an event which might otherwise have been the London Olympics and the business of the big capital and nothing much to do with us. I thought that the LOCOG plan to engage with communities around the country, and I remember people were rather laughing about this extraordinarily circuitous torch relay that went to everywhere and had little community events dotted along it. It was a brilliant way to raise expectations and make people from as far away as Shetland feel that they were part of an Olympics which otherwise might have been seen as something that was particular to the capital. And it is one of the areas where, if I had a frustration, if only we were able to apply that sort of brain power to the legacy that we applied to the setting up of the event with the communities, I think that would be a tremendous thing, and I'll raise that again in a minute. So I hope when I talk about this in Salford, you don't feel that I'm talking about something that was completely irrelevant to you, because I think we all felt that we were part of something that was effectively a national event. Now, I'm just going to highlight who the key players were in this case study. Clearly, we have a cabinet government. In the cabinet, the key players were the then Culture, Media and Sport, Jeremy Hunt, and the Home Secretary, Theresa May. Theresa May had taken the country's national guarantee that it would provide security for the Olympics, which was given to the International Olympic Committee when the bid was secured, and she was responsible for delivering a safe and secure Games. And Philip Hammond, the Secretary of State for Defence on the right, had no direct role, except he was my boss and therefore was the man who authorised the use of the military. But it was very, very much working to Theresa May. And of course there was never any disagreement at all at any stage during this process. But I'm afraid in order to get a decision, you tended to have to go to the top for adjudication between the various interests between the organisation. And I have a concern that at one stage, I'll mention it again in a minute, but the idea of the Games and the effectiveness of the Games was subsumed by the credibility of the security, which of course is absolutely the wrong way around, because the Games are what it was all about. The guy, I don't know if it was certainly on the Evening Standard, I don't know if it ever appeared in the papers up here, but the guy with his bum to you on the zip wire is Boris. I mean, who else could it be? Very important player in some of the decision-making, some of the cabinet discussions. He played a role in influencing the eventual decisions that were made. So that was the government, critically important. Did any of you watch 2020 on BBC Two, I think it was? It was a piss-take programme. Very nearly true. That's the sort of LOCOG lot. And I had to caveat, because LOCOG were fantastic, but it was really good. And if anybody watch it, I just remember having a meeting at one stage where somebody couldn't turn up, so they were on the telephone. And rather than just having a normal sort of, the telephone was placed on the chair next to me and sort of pulled up to that. It was a very surreal experience. LOCOG had as its chairman Sebastian Coe. Its chief executive was Paul Dayton, the chap on the top right, now ennobled and working in the Treasury. From a business background, a banking background, very, very clever, very, very good chief executive. And the bloke bottom right, a chap called Doug Arnott, was a professional Olympic runner, organiser, not runner. He had been involved in 5 previous Olympics. He really knew what was going on and knew all the people. So the guys who I dealt with were principally Doug, and the policeman bottom left, Sir Ian Johnson, who had been the chief constable of the British Transport Police. I just couldn't resist putting that picture up. And if you bubble me, I'm in trouble. The police were headed up by Chris Allison, the guy in the middle, a commander, a very, very experienced Metropolitan Police officer, a lot of public order experience, a very, very measured guy, an enormous amount of responsibility because, as you know, normally the constabulary has its independence, so each of the forces have their independence. Chris had to bring most forces together. I mean, there were football matches all around the country, and Chris had the responsibility for the safety and security of those football matches, and he worked with the other chief constables very well. Cressida Dick on the right was responsible for counter-terrorism, very important, won't talk about it anymore. And Bob Broadhurst, the guy on the left, was Gold Command London. So he was effectively the copper responsible for London's security. There were Weymouth football venues and so on. And there were some other venues like whitewater canoeing, which were outside London. But Bob had the biggest job of all. My friends. G4S, the guy in the middle, the chief executive of G4S, Nick Buckles. The guy on the left was their chief operating officer, David Taylor-Smith. And on the right, in the natty chalk stripe suit, Ian Horseman-Seal, who was their events manager. That happened at the end. So Nick Buckles is still there, chief executive, but those other two guys have been given the push. And interesting. I have no idea how business works. I'm just sort of... The athletes, really important group, because of course they needed to feel that there wasn't any hassle. They needed to be able to concentrate on what they were doing. And there was a moment in the week before the games where I think they were getting a little... They may have felt that things weren't quite as they should be, and really critical to make the athletes happy. Now, I put this slide up. I don't know if any of you saw the greatest team parade after the Olympics, which was a parade run by Boris Johnson, where the Princess Royal spoke to start with, and she said some very sort of princessly things, very measured things, and then the Prime Minister stood up and made some sort of Prime Ministerly things and looked good. And then Boris stood up and he gave one of the fun, and there were, I suppose, millions of people watching, one of the funniest speeches I've ever heard. And I just wanted to remind you, if you heard it, or tell you if you didn't. At one stage he said, speaking as a spectator, talking to the athletes, you produced such paroxysms of joy on the sofas of Britain that you probably not only inspired a generation, but helped to create one as well. It is interesting that there are some people who can get away with it. A zip wire and that. The public were clearly important, and the bit in the middle of that slide, you may remember there were quite a lot of empty seats early on in the event. This was, it was a bureaucratic glitch because, of course, the International Olympic Committee had allocated seats to other countries and the media and so on, and therefore all the seats that had been made available were filled, but there were a whole bunch of them that weren't for reasons that I don't know. The good thing about it was that when the military started to have to take a far bigger hand, we got the very fortunate opportunity to put people into those empty seats, which was a great way of making people feel a bit valued. So it was a sort of win-win for everybody. But the public, incredibly important to maintain the confidence of the public, make them feel that the place was secure and that we had our act together. I'm just going to quickly explain to you the security concept so you know what I'm talking about. In the middle was the venue, the Olympic Park, Earl's Court, where or the XL or Weymouth, the venue where the sporting activity took place. And that was the responsibility of LOCOG to secure. Immediately round it was a sort of reaction zone. If something were to happen in the venue, the police and the emergency services would be responsible for reacting in the way they normally do, but with contingency plans for each of these venues. Outside that was normal policing. I mean, one of the great cries that I was always told was, these are business as usual. These are the blue games. This is policing, to be seen as policing as it normally is. And all those normal organisations were expected to cover the external security of London and everywhere else as normal. We, in the early stages, were only responsible for providing things called specific defence support requests. None of those in the early stages were for venue security. Indeed, we were told quite clearly that we were not to be involved in venue security because some people felt it would send the wrong message. But we were expected to provide bomb disposal, which we do anyway on a day-to-day basis. We were expected to provide maritime security in Weymouth. I mean, the Dorset police simply do not have the capability to protect that huge area of Weymouth Bay, so we put a ship there. We assisted the Metropolitan Police on the Thames with rigid raiders from the Marines. And then in the air, we had the requirement to provide air security to the Olympic Park, specifically to the Olympic Stadium. And this was a request which came to us from outside. We did our analysis and came up with a plan, more of which in a minute. And then outside all of that, as you would expect, there was a lot of work to identify where there could be challenges using intelligence and then disrupting them at a distance so things didn't come into our area and you didn't ever have to deal with them at all. And I think in the end, with the benefit of hindsight, it is that outer ring that was the most effective element of the Olympic security, overall Olympic security plan. But in December 2011, it became clear that they had got the figures wrong for the number of people that needed to protect the venues. And I at that point, started a debate about whether or not the military could assist with the venue security. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In the maritime area, I've mentioned the HMS Bulwark, which was at Weymouth. We brought HMS Ocean into London. Much the best way to put a helicopter landing pad in the middle of London. You just park it by Greenwich and you can stick helicopters on it very easily, and it actually doesn't disrupt people. They had ship tours on it. It was all very benign. And it also allowed us to have dormitory accommodation for extra troops. So hard lying in that ship was a very handy way of assisting us with logistics. And I've mentioned the rigid raiders on the Thames. The land capability, we did have always had 1,000 people earmarked as a military contingency force, not armed, but trained to do all the various security tasks, but with no set role. They were a contingency force to step in if things went wrong at any stage. And the two bits at the top, interestingly, on the M6 toll, 4 days before the Olympics, it was about July the 23rd or 24th, there was an incident on the M6 where a bus stopped and there was a chemical threat, apparently, allegedly. Completely coincidentally, we had an exercise going on about 6 miles down the road, completely coincidentally, an exercise going on about 6 miles down the road with our chemical response team. And the chemical response team reacted very, very quickly to this, probably maybe accused of overreacting, but we reacted very, very quickly to this. And it turned out to be a bloke who'd got off a broken down bus with one of those electronic cigarettes and had been puffing away on electronic. It had been reported, and the next thing he knew, he was being stuck in a little tent and fumigated. But interestingly, it sent a very interesting signal out to anybody who might have been listening that we appeared to be able to react quite quickly. There was an element of luck in it, but we did show that we could react quite quickly. So that was the land capability. I don't know, do any of you watch Dad's Army? The air side, I mean, it caused a huge amount of ruckus. And was there a requirement to put Rapier missiles in the middle of Blackheath? Well, yes, if you tell me that you want to have point defence of the Olympic Park when the 100-metre final is running. And if you tell me that the threat is from either a hijacked business jet or somebody who climbs into a microlight or a small aircraft and is going to go what we call low and slow, you have to have a capability to deal with it. So if we're told that that is the intelligence picture, we produced what I believe was a very measured, layered response to it. And actually, very, very emotive in the telling. The evidence of it was tiny. And the bloke with a dog walking past the rapier on Blackheath, very quickly it became a relatively, I mean, it seems a bit over the top now, but it was a relatively benign part because of all the talk that had been going on beforehand. We used helicopters to intercept this low, slow threat and had to position them either on HMS Ocean or in a Territorial Army centre in Ilford. And we brought some fast jets down to the small airport at North Holt, which has a relatively short runway, but that thing can take off if it's going on a very short trip. And that meant that we reduced the reaction time if something was to come up to minutes. And they sat there and did their own thing, causing the gentleman in, there was a gentleman in the block of flats, which you can see the people on top of the tower there, who got himself very agitated. And in the Fred Wigg Tower, which is this baby here, very smelly lift, a lawyer had a go at us for not warning the public sufficiently beforehand, which was a bit unfair because we'd done a huge amount of community engagement beforehand, both with the residents and with the local authority. And the legal challenge was thrown out. But it was all of it, it ramped this thing up to a level which was probably unnecessary. Although I'm sure for those of you with a non-military view, it might have felt an overreaction. But I'm afraid, as I go back to say, if that is the level of security that's required, this was a reasonable way to approach it. And we launched a few times, but no serious, nothing where my blood pressure went up. As I was saying, by December 11, we had been told to produce an additional 7,500 people to fill this gap that had emerged. And the increase in people for venue security was very significant, and automatically it was assumed that G4S would be able to increase their numbers to something in excess of 10,000. And we would provide the balance of 7,500. And there was plenty of notice. I knew that we could do it without affecting anybody who was on operations in Afghanistan or anything like that. So this was, in my view, a perfectly reasonable call. This was a national event. We were doing our bit. It was relatively easy to train people. We took about 5 days training for people to do their job, mostly training them down. If you've been training people to go and do search and security in Afghanistan, you don't want them, you don't want full body search of somebody who's coming in to watch the basketball. So there was a bit of sort of training down, which actually, again, I think I underestimated the quality of our people who were quite able to work that out for themselves. And that looked like that the profile, if you like, was shown on this slide, which with the Olympic Games in the middle, with just under 7,500, and then these shoulders, where we first built up as we secured that they locked down each of the venues during that period of July, and then the Paralympics at the end. And the lockdown period, this period at the beginning took me by surprise. I hadn't realised that the security depended on certification of each venue, and therefore the lockdown programme was critical if you were going to arrive at the 27th with every venue properly secured. And therein lies a tale which I come to now. First indication of a problem was in early May when they had test events on the Olympic Park, and Paul Dayton, Chief Executive of LOCOG, came to me and said, could you move the people that you've put on the back gate? We put some soldiers on the back gate as a sort of trial. Would you move the people from the back gate and put them on the front gate, the Stratford Road gate? And I was quite surprised because I thought this was branding, exactly the branding that people didn't want, soldiers on the front gate. And I rang up G4S, who I had assumed would want to be in the shop window, and they showed very little interest. The sort of high level of G4S didn't seem to be too bothered. So I was quite happy because it was going to be good publicity for us, and I thought our people would be happier doing something where they had more contact with the public. So we agreed to that, but first occasion for a little alarm bell. Then at the very beginning of July, as the Olympic Park was due to be locked down, the contractors didn't turn up. And of course, as I said, the lockdown program was critical that it stayed on track. And so they made me deploy the military contingency force, that bunch of people, 1,000 people, onto the Olympic Park so that the searches could go ahead and the place could be locked down. And it was still a way out, but it was clear that the G4S mechanisms for just-in-time delivery of a zero-hour security contract, which is the methodology that was being used, wasn't reacting quickly enough and with enough people to the demand that had been set on, even in the shoulder period, the early stages of the operation. At that point, we had 4,000 contingency forces set aside in case things went wrong. We had justified them to government on the basis that we would take 2,000 immediate forces who are always on standby in case something happens, and then after 48 hours replace them, so it's a little bit longer, replace them with another load of people who you would have on lower notice to move. So you would sort of bring people in one after the other. But I knew I could use all of them if we had to. So we had a total of 4,000, and at that point, confirmed by a problem at Eton Dorney, where the very wet weather had caused the build of the stands at Eton Dorney to go slower than they had originally intended, and that put the lockdown programme out. That meant that we started to stand people too, without the authority of the Home Office. The Home Office were not prepared to authorise this because they believed that it would send the wrong messages to G4S, and the answer was to keep on beating the contractor over the head until they delivered what they had been told to do. And that remained the Home Office position up until the 11th of July, when the bloke on the left waved the white flag and said that the systems that they had in place were not going to be able to deliver the venue security staff that were required. And at that point, and it wasn't very long to react, we scaled up the operation to something in the region of 13,500. That meant pulling people back from Germany. It meant finding new venues for them, new locations in the middle of London, not the easiest thing to do for them to live. We took over an old shopping centre that had gone bust, and it was a very good place for us to put our people. We were worried that we were going to run out of coaches, because coaches were being used a hell of a lot with all the extra activity that was going on in the tourist industry, which we managed to scrape through. We had aimed off a little bit beforehand. And then on the 23rd and 24th of July, I felt very strongly that we still hadn't sent a strong enough signal to the world that we were getting ahead of an error. And I asked for an additional 1,200 people to be deployed so that the venue general managers could forget about security, know that we had it under control, and get on with the sport. And there was a little bit of a fight in Cabinet. I don't think the Home Secretary will ever talk to me again, but in my view, common sense prevailed, and we overcorrected and announced to everybody that we were going to deliver another 1,200 people into the mix, who we used, but we might have got by without using them, but we would have sent the wrong signals. We needed to send a signal to the world that we had this absolutely under control and the games were going to go ahead effectively. And then on the 27th, everything was in place. 13,500 altogether. I do like it that Liz is on that. So, but then, that is completely coincidental. And that's the SILT chart of our eventual response, which is quite a significant change from the original plan, blowing my own trumpet. And the result was massive public appreciation. I mean, the response that we got from the public was overwhelming. And that, of course, brought the best out in our people, who felt they were helping with a crisis. So there was a real virtue in the response. Very happy athletes. Interestingly, on Tuesday, the first Tuesday of the Games, do you remember we hadn't won any gold medals? And people were, you could just see the media stories starting, you know, all this money and we're not winning any gold medals. The first person to win a gold medal was Hannah Stenning, a captain in the army. So the army even saved the day, and I don't repeat that, anybody who's tweeting. By the Paralympics, G4S were doing this on their own. They had got their systems in a working to an extent where they were, by the time we got to the end bump, they were doing it effectively themselves. Unfortunately, confidence, the system's confidence, had been dented, and I had to keep, I think, too many people on standby in case they started to fail. But their model started to work. It just started to work a bit too late, and that doesn't help when there's an Olympic opening ceremony. I mean, it showed that the just-in-time business process, with nothing set aside for contingency, doesn't work in certain circumstances. The legacy of this thing, and I can go off on one a little bit, I think we did get bullet one. I mean, I think Britain's status as a sporting nation has gone up significantly. Personal view as a result of this. There's no question we've done number 2 for the moment. I mean, has it been announced West Ham and all that? But I think, I mean, those of you who've been to East London, it has been transformed. And so that, I really worry that the opportunity that was, in my view, magnified tenfold by the public response to the Olympics and that sense of sort of happiness while the games were going on, which to me was a perfect backdrop to inspiring a generation. As I said, alluded to earlier, I just don't feel that has had the impetus. The programme's gone into the Cabinet Office, which is... for me, I'll whip over these, but the military lessons that we learned were the difficulty in defining a requirement. The earlier you can define a requirement, the better you'll be able to meet it, and they didn't. And I think they should have had the military in on defining the requirement a little bit earlier. This was a very complicated command and control structure where in military terms, the main effort that I gave my subordinates was to understand what was going on, which sounds a bit odd, but it meant that I could then conduct some quite complex, not necessarily command and control. You're leading from behind in Homeland Security. You're not trying to be too bossy. There was a moment when we became bossy here. I think the dependence on commercial practices is not necessarily the right thing in every circumstance. In some cases, it is absolutely the right thing to do, but not in everything. And I think I've made my point about the utility of the armed forces as groups of well-disciplined men and women. And we do things in little numbers now. I had to deploy just under 22,000 people. That was quite an eye-watering number, and it was a great... Well, I was very proud of the way the military logistics and mechanisms worked when they came under a great deal of strain. And I think we mustn't forget scale as we draw down. And that really is it. And I've talked for 5 minutes longer than I was supposed to. Sorry.